and we'll see how that works. Can people in the back row hear me okay? How's that? There we go. Thank you very much, Jeff Baker. I was just about to practice my best thespian voice. Thank you for saving everyone and me that embarrassment. My name is Andrew Reeser. I teach U.S. history here at Dutchess Community College, and I'm also the president of the World Affairs Council of the Mid-Hudson Valley. That's the organization that sponsored this event entitled Slavery Today, a film discussion and a film screening and community discussion on human trafficking. Let me start by asking all of you to silence your devices. I'm old enough to have once told the people at such a gathering to turn off their pagers. Of course, about half of you, maybe less, know what a pager is. But in any event, if it goes beep, just make sure it doesn't during the course of this event. The World Affairs Council of the Mid-Hudson Valley is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, membership-driven organization devoted to an essentially educational mission, which is raising awareness and understanding of global issues and global affairs in the 3 counties we serve, Dutchess, Orange, and Ulster. I'd like to encourage you to visit our website, www.hvworldaffairscouncil.org, to learn more about us, our upcoming events, and also how to be a member. Membership fees are very reasonable. We even offer students the Blue Plate Special membership fee of $5 a year. What can you get for $5 a year? These days, I encourage students, we have educator rates, individual, dual, and other kinds of institutional memberships. We would have to sell you the one you prefer for a completely tax-deductible amount. And for that, you get a chance to know that you're supporting events like this that raise awareness about how global affairs impact us here in the Hudson Valley. You get a chance to attend our membership-only dinners at the CIA, a fantastic place to have dinner and to learn more about world affairs. Advance notice of our events and other benefits. So I'd encourage you to check out the information kiosk, which is right outside the theater. After our event is over, to pick up a brochure and add your name and email, or phone if you prefer, to our information list. And we'd be happy to tell you more about the World Affairs Council. Tonight's program is made possible in large part by our parent organization, the World Affairs Councils of America, with funding from the Carlson Family Foundation. We're also grateful to Jeff Baker and Peggy Knoll for their hard work on the somewhat complex choreography of this particular event. And also, I'd like to thank the academic leadership at the college, especially the entire leadership team, of course, but especially the Dean of Academic Affairs, Dr. Ellen Gambino, and the President of Dutchess Community College, Dr. Pamela Eddington. If you would, please join me in thanking all those who made this event possible. Without any further ado, let's begin our program, which has 3 parts. A 60-minute film. Second, about a 25-minute panel discussion, which will actually be a conversation between panelists. This is a new format for us, and I'm looking forward to trying it out. Completely unscripted, and so stay tuned for that. The third part will be community discussion, a chance for the audience members to ask questions and for our panelists to respond. I've made it clear to my students that this is a 2-hour event. If they wanted the extra credit that I had offered, they would have to put in that time. If intrinsic rewards don't motivate you, I'll use shame as a motivator. This is actually half serious here. If the victims of human trafficking can endure years of or even decades of torture and abuse, then we can sit in a comfortable chair for 120 minutes. So that's my appeal, to actually make this full event with all of its moving parts that we can all enjoy together. Those 3 parts: the film, the panel discussion, and then a chance for audience Q&A. You're about to watch the first major feature-length documentary film on modern slavery or human trafficking. And by the way, there's some politics in terms of the choice of nomenclature and semantics between those 2 terms. It's entitled Not My Life. It's by an award-winning filmmaker by the name of Robert Bilheimer. The narrator is Hollywood actress Glenn Close. Music by Susan Tedeschi, Derek Trucks, Bob Dylan makes an appearance in the score. As Robert Bilheimer said, human traffickers are earning billions of dollars on the backs and in the beds of children. And yet no one knows this is happening. Perhaps this film and the discussion we have about it will change this for you. And there are opportunities to continue the discussion if you check our website about more events coming up here in the Hudson Valley. If Jeff in the booth will cue the movie and dim the lights, we'll begin this film by Robert Bilheimer entitled Not My Life.
People think this is an issue of the transportation of people or the smuggling of people, when in fact, the real issue is the exploitation of people.
We have for labor, for begging, for adoption,
farming and factories, you see the domestic servitude.
Well, human trafficking is just a convenient solution.
It's a slave trade. We call it trafficking.
It's a very well organized industry.
You'll be amazed how few people really know that it exists.
Slavery only exists because someone has violent control over another
The
person.
loss of control to the victim.
Inequality, poverty, vulnerability.
That's what defines human
There
trafficking.
is a global pandemic of violence that's unleashed on women and
I
girls.
don't use the word inhuman because it's humans that do this stuff. It exists in every country of the world, including the United States of
This
America.
isn't always the land of the free.
And when you understand the issue in that way, that's the true essence of what we're fighting against.
Nsuom no wapra. Akonsuase. Aya akonsuase. Oh, when you do.
For most of these children, their resilience is so great that they can go from an almost zombie-like existence of brutality, which is a reaction to brutality, to a pretty normal childhood. A happy, playing, educated, enthusiastic kid. And I've watched this miracle time and time again. And it absolutely floors me. And in fact, I've got to say, if there's one thing that keeps me doing what I'm doing, it's that. It's watching those kids go from being kids without hope and kids without any light in their eyes and kids without any play in their hearts to being free, happy kids again.
A 1,000 miles from Lake Volta in Senegal, malnutrition, physical torture, and 7-day work weeks are also the fate of some 50,000 street beggars known as the Talibé. The Talibé are young boys who have been sent by their families to religious schools, where they are taught the principles and practices of Islam by teachers known as the Marabout. The cultural tradition of sending children to Quranic schools is an honored one in Senegal. But like the fishing trade in Ghana, it has been infiltrated by criminals and ruined by greed.
History of forced child begging started with the noblest of intention. In time, however, it became something of an efficient, sadly efficient commercial exploitation of children. They live in the most wretched condition, in the most wretched lack of sanity that you can imagine. One Marabout told me in a very ignorant way that nothing will happen to the kid because God will protect them. They can eat nasty food, they can eat spoiled food, nothing will happen to them. But things do happen to them. What happened is that the constant sickness for this kid is stomach sickness, skin sickness. Many of them die. They do die from the actual living condition, and they also die from the beating of the Marabout.
There's no place where we're really, with a sense of urgency and compassion, doing what we need to do to protect the world's children from being used and abused. And every day, there are children everywhere whose rights are being violated and whose lives are being ruined.
The exploitation of millions of children is by no means confined to Africa. There are more than 190 countries in the world, and virtually all of them enslave children, women, and men within or across their borders. The vast majority of the victims are poor.
Poverty is an incredible factor in making men, women, and children, and particularly children and women who constitute most of the victims, in making them vulnerable to the slave trade.
The lives of many of the world's poor are lived on the streets. And nowhere are the streets more crowded with children, millions of them, than in India.
6 children go missing every hour in India, and they don't disappear in thin air. These children are stolen, by the traffickers at local level, and they are sold to different people, and then they are further sold to work as child slaves or child prostitutes or child forced laborers or child domestic labor. So it's a big nexus which operates right from the village level in the remotest parts of India to the big cities and towns.
Welcome to the Ghazipur landfill in the city of New Delhi. It is illegal for children to even be at this poisonous place. But the city needs their services to process the garbage, so middlemen let some children in and profit by their labor.
We are talking about the loss of freedom and human dignity. We are talking about the most inhuman torture one can think of, where a human being loses its name and face and identity and dignity and everything.
Rising before dawn, working all day, the children are paid virtually nothing. They suffer from malnutrition and are vulnerable to disease from the hazardous waste. The stench at the dump is sickening. It is like hell in this place.
Physical handicaps at times are so severe, either material which burns right through the bones of the hands of the child, or to the eye, or to the shape of the body, being bent for 12 hours a day, probably 6.5 days a week.
What kind of world creates the Ghazipur garbage pickers, the fishing boys of Lake Volta, or the Talibay beggars? Who are the slavers, traffickers, and middlemen who earn their livings on the backs and in the beds of our children?
Traffickers are just lazy. They're just looking to surf off of the preconditions that exist in our world.
They think of money as a big thing. They don't care about human being. They have no moral.
Whether it's people working in the apparel industry in Jordan or working in the biofuel sector in Brazil. But I think this is an age-old problem of people who are willing to treat others like they aren't fellow human beings.
It is the worst, in many ways, the worst manifestation of what people can do to other people.
Ancient people, the Romani, also known as Romas, or Gypsies, live in Central and Eastern Europe. Extremely poor, Romas are prime prey for human traffickers who travel to remote villages to recruit boys for begging and girls for the thriving sex trade in Western Europe. Trihan, a Turkish-Romanian trafficker in Zoha prison in Bucharest, describes his recruiting technique.
Nu mă simt vinovat. Deci am fost la bună înțelegere, eu mă duceam, poate erau familii care erau mamă și fiică și mă duceam la femeile lor care erau amărâți și spuneam, măi, decât să stați amărâți, să cerșiți sau să, eu știu, mă rog, să furați, să dați în cap, uite, poți merge cu mine afară în străinătate și îți ofer mai multe chestii.
The human traffickers in Zoha prison are mostly middlemen in the big business machine of buying and selling girls on the European continent. They commit vicious crimes, but are almost never severely punished.
Traffickers, they are very aware of our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities, and they exploit it. They know where the legislation is the weakest, or where the current political constellations don't really prioritize this, or where there are a lot of poor children that could be exploited. They are very clever, and they also know that they risk very little, because very few of them get caught.
You have bigger penalties for dealing drugs And yet, for dealing human beings, which is slavery, is no other word for it, maybe you will end up in prison for 7 years. But if you're a good guy, you can come out in 4.
Când eram mai mic, aveam vreo 14 ani, așa, început prima dată a fost mai mult o prostie. Am luat o fată din ziar și care se ocupa era prostituată. M-am dat drept client, am luat-o, am sechestrat-o și am vândut-o la alți pești. Am văzut că banii care este am început.
What's amazing about him is that he's also from a wealthy family, you know. But that's quite common right now in Romania. You have many troubled kids from wealthy families, kids that go on wrong ways and do awful stuff. You know, he admits that he harmed those girls for life, but he's not like having any remorses about this because for him, you know, life is just valued differently.
Nu le dădeam să mănânce, le băteam.
Cum? Tot timpul. Loveai cu palma sau ce făceai?
Da, cu pumnul, deci nu, deja mă enervam și eu eram mai bididiu, mai mic, aveam impresii și le băteam picioarele cu pumnii.
They would just keep the girls against their will and would tell them that at that point they were kidnapped, they were their property. They would strip naked the girls, they would take their IDs, they would beat them.
Nu știu, după părerea mea că toată viața o să trăiască cu coșmarul ăsta. Și vezi, unele mai reușesc să se schimbe, dar nu o să mai putea să fie femeie normală niciodată.
Every time when I say no, I don't want to do that. I don't want. You can beat me, you can do anything you want. He beat me so much, he missing one teeth, and I was pregnant. And every time when he beat me, I go off the floor and I do that, and
to protect?
Yes, to protect, yeah. Nobody knows I'm pregnant because yes.
I heard about some kind of training facility, in the countryside nearby big cities in Albania, and the girls were, brought from abroad, trained there, then to be sent to the market in Italy mainly, but also to other countries in Europe. And the kind of stories you could hear was, execution of one girl to show to the other ones that they don't have to move. And either shot or burned.
After beating up a girl, you bury her alive, and just the face stays out. And you ask her, are you going to run again? And then you cover her face for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, enough for her to choke, clean her face, and keep on doing that, amusing yourself for half a day or whatever.
I remember several times I have seen, young girls with their breasts all burnt because of cigarettes. I have seen and I have met women that they were shot on the streets, and one of the girls, I remember, she became paralyzed.
There is a denial. We don't want to see it. We don't want to really understand why they are there. We don't want to have it confirmed because it's painful and it's frustrating and it's shameful as well. Why do we accept it? It's our children. And it shouldn't be like that.
Between 2003 and 2007, working out of Oklahoma City, The FBI conducted the first widespread human trafficking operation in the United States. Overseen by Special Agent Mike Beaver, Operation Stormy Nights resulted in the conviction of 15 pimps and human traffickers working throughout the American Midwest. Most of the traffickers' victims were young teenage girls.
Angie was one of the girls that was involved in our case here in Oklahoma City. She was a child that came out of Wichita, Kansas, and she came from a good family. She had a mom and dad at home early in her life. She attended public schools initially and then went on to even attend private schools. By all accounts, she was, an all-American girl. She was socialized well and educated well, and everything was going pretty good for her through her adolescence and up to her early teens until she started to experience some issues that led her down a path that she wasn't real proud of.
Probably the year after I went to private school, I started going to a public school, and that was my sophomore year, and I didn't really know who I was. I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere. I didn't really get along with my dad for a while, but it was just normal teenage problems, and I just get depressed at school.
Two of her friends approached her, two young kids, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old in Wichita. And they collectively, these three young girls, said, "Why don't we run away?" And Angie thought it was not a bad idea, and it might give her a break from what she considered to be a lot of crisis in her life. And one of the girls that she was with said, "Let me call a guy I know in Oklahoma City." And that individual subsequently traveled from Oklahoma City to Wichita, where he picked these three young girls up. Little did they know that he was a pimp.
I started to, feel a little uncomfortable because now I don't even know where we're going. I'm starting to freak out because I don't even know who this guy is. And we were driving past Wichita, going to Oklahoma City, and I was just like, I could just get out right now, and I could go home, and I could tell my parents I'm sorry that I left, and it could just be all okay right now. And just then, like as if he was reading my mind, he turns around and he's like, "Don't even think about asking me to let you out now. You better just tuck and roll." And I was just kind of like, so I'm really gonna have to die before I get to go home now.
And he starts to control, and after a very short time, that child has no option but to stay under his command. And for them to break away and to talk to law enforcement or to call and reach out for help, they truly feel, and in some instances it would be safe to say, that their life would come to an end.
We pull up at a truck stop, and it's like an alley just right on the other side of this fence. He tells us to get out. He tells us what kind of prices we're going to charge and exactly what we're going to do. It was like 20 for a blowjob, 40 for sex, and like 80 for both. We get in the first truck, and the guy decides he wants me. So I go back there, and I just have to just pray to God, just please help me, just please let me get through it. And then Melissa went through his wallet, and he had grandkids as old as us. And all I could think about the whole time was how my grandpa could be this guy right now, and how that would feel. And I just wanted to die. And then I started to just think that maybe I deserved this for doing this to my parents and to myself.
Angie, for the most part, came through her tragedy. She's got her feet on the ground, and she's moving forward wanting to help people. And has a story that I think represents well what the nation is facing when we look at these kids that are being trafficked domestically right here on our own land.
Even a girl that's from like upstate and has like everything, like car, nice home, money, jewelry, everything, you know, it can be something that she's missing in her life, and it could be like she doesn't have a good relationship with her mother, or, you know, anything like that, and that can make her, you know, vulnerable to this, you know. So I really believe like this is something that can really happen to anybody.
It's fair to say that these kids are being exploited at the hands of more than just truck drivers. In fact, it would be a misrepresentation to say it's just truck drivers. We're seeing them purchased and abused by both white collar and blue collar type individuals.
More than 100,000 underage girls are trafficked for sex in the United States today. They come from all economic and ethnic backgrounds. They are found not only at truck stops, but on the internet, in motels and hotels, and of course, on city streets. Sheila White was trafficked on the streets of New York and often beaten by her pimp in plain sight. She now works with victims and survivors throughout the state.
Who's the hoe? Hey, not out here, not out here. Hey, don't do that.
You get to a point where you begin to feel numb. I mean, I done got beaten up in front of the Port Authority in Times Square, and you would think, you know, and this is like probably like 2 years after 9/11, so security out there was, you know, massive. A lot of police officers, a lot of, you know, and Times Square is a busy place, and you would think that for someone to get beat up literally in front of the Port Authority, you would think somebody would stop and say something or ask you if you're all right, if you need help, but it didn't happen. I mean, he even had time to smoke a cigarette. And it's like when stuff like that happens in the open, you really feel like you're not even a person.
How does a very young girl wind up being for sale? If that girl was born in poverty-stricken Nepal, she is prey to traffickers from the earliest days of her childhood.
You have children who are very vulnerable, working in factories and compounds, and sex traffickers come in and use those places as source spots for children who go into sex slavery. So it's all intertwined, you know. Children who are working are vulnerable.
Here, girls begin their lives as slaves by making rugs that will eventually be sold to wealthy consumers in the West. These girls are examples of child labor in the supply chain, which includes not only the carpets in our homes, but the clothes we wear and the food we eat.
It's an irony that many of the products which we use in our daily life, they are made by children who are trafficked and enslaved. Brothels and workshops and factories in many ways are the dark holes of slavery.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child.
In case of brothels, it is like living hell, where you cannot raise your voice. If the girls raise their voice, they are abused and beaten up. We came across many examples where they were burned with cigarettes, where they were tied down on the cots and raped just for making some mistakes. And their mistakes were that they don't want to attend 10 customers a day. They want to attend only 5 customers.
This world out here is lonely and cold. This world out here is lonely and cold. This world out here is lonely and cold. I guess I'll go back home. I guess I'll go back home. Why did I leave the ones that I love? Why did I run away? Now I pray to the Lord above. Let me go home and stay.
The physical scars and injuries could be treated and cured, but the mental torture is something which is incurable. They lose self-confidence. They lose trust in others. They shatter all their dreams.
But even the brothels of India do not compare to the volume and brutality of what is found in countries like Cambodia, where global sex tourism is big business. On the shores of the Mekong River, outside Phnom Penh, live children whose lives are in daily danger. To the homes of these poor families come sex traffickers, looking for young girls to bring into the city where travelers from abroad await them.
Standing here in Svay Pak, a small Vietnamese village on the outskirts of Phnom Penh, Cambodia. It's the top destination for sex tourists in the world. They run rings of children here that have no value to them aside from the income that they produce for them by selling them to foreigners for sex on a daily and nightly basis.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of the places where sex tourists go are the places that have had a reputation for offering children for prostitution for hundreds of years. The difference, of course, is it's not just a sailor off of a ship. It's the drumbeat, beat, beat, beat of airplanes landing every day.
Right behind me, you see the two-story yellow building. Looks pretty nice compared to the other buildings back there. That's one of the brothels specifically for young girls. Westerners, foreigners from all over the world come to that brothel every day.
And what do you have down behind that little alleyway? What do you see when you go back there?
You'll see a row upon row, actually, of tiny little shacks. You'll see little boardwalks, and I mean little narrow boards that walk in between those places. Those are holding pens for young girls. And when a Westerner or, again, a foreigner comes to this village, they'll take them back there. They'll go house to house, or shack to shack, really, look at the girls, pick one out, and then have them delivered to their guest house or the hotel that you're staying at.
And the guest house is also in the vicinity?
Yeah, usually they take them back to Phnom Penh.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then it depends on the deal they negotiate. Could keep them for as little as overnight or a few hours to a week or a month. Oh yeah, guys will come and they'll take a girl for a month. We have girls at our aftercare center who guys would come in once a quarter and have pick up that same girl and have them with them for a month at a time. And I mean, just brutalize them for that month. Westerners come into Svay Pak every day. I mean, there's not a single day Westerners don't come here, and there's no reason to come here except for that, you know. We've had over 100 girls, and as part of their therapy to tell the stories and what they've been through, 100% across the board, they say the worst pedophiles are from the United States. 100%. The most abusive, just things, again, we can't imagine.
ចាំនៅដែលគេយកខ្ញុំទៅលក់គឺខ្ញុំនៅអាយុ7ឆ្នាំហើយអ្នកដែលលក់ខ្ញុំគឺម្ដាយខ្ញុំពិតប្រាកដដែលខ្ញុំទៅយកខ្ញុំទៅលក់ហើយដោយសារតែគាត់ចាញ់បោកមេខ្យល់ដែលបានទៅលួងលោមគាត់នៅផ្ទះរបស់ខ្ញុំហើយរយៈពេលដែលខ្ញុំមកដល់ទីក្រុងភ្នំពេញគឺខ្ញុំជួបហេតុការណ៍ដ៏អាក្រក់មួយគឺគេយកខ្ញុំទៅដាក់ក្នុងផ្ទះបនដែលទៅគេប្រកាសខ្ញុំទទួលភ្ញៀវហើយគេដូចថាខ្ញុំមកទទួលខ្ញុំនិយាយថាខ្ញុំបដិសេធអញ្ចឹងគេប្រើទរណកម្មផ្សេងដូចជាសក់ឆៃភ្លើងឲ្យញ៉ាំម្ទេសហើយនឹងថាឲ្យសត្វតិចសត្វផ្សេងតិចហើយបន្ទាប់មកគេយកនាងខ្ញុំទៅដេហើយនៅទៅដេរយៈពេល3ដងទៅថាទៅដេភ្លាមដូចថាដេថ្ងៃហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងត្រូវល្ងាចឡើងត្រូវទទួលភ្ញៀវ
We noticed the earlier stage that we rescue them, the better chance we give them in recovery. Better still, if we can prevent that from happening in the first place, would be good. But yeah, and that's why I had to say I am all for prevention more than cure, because you rescue 10 today, 20 coming in tomorrow, and you keep doing the same thing over and over again. So we need to do something more than just rescue.
How great is the suffering created by slavery in the world today? Sophia Chun knows. Her daughter, Sakni, was kidnapped and is now most likely a trafficking victim herself.
And it's been 2 years and a half now that I still have no news. Yeah, it's not knowing that killing me, and especially working in the field that I'm working with this girl, talking to them, knowing their story, knowing their suffering, how they go through their life in the brothel. I just can't help it. What if my daughter's in that same situation, you know? You try to forget by burying yourself with work, helping others, but now and then the knife is turned and twist because you have a glimpse of a young girl that looks similar to her, or you reminded of her by something that she used to do, a song that she used to sing. It's something that you can never really get over.
Crimes of sexual violence by human traffickers and their customers are unspeakable and obscene. It is almost impossible to believe that many of these children have been sold as virgins, sewn back up, then raped again and again. Children like this are everywhere. The United States, India, Africa, Europe, throughout Southeast Asia. They stand before us as our greatest shame. But in their courage and in their spirit, these beautiful children are living proof that all hope need not be lost. Guatemala City, a dangerous and violent place where law enforcement is stretched to the limits. Child exploitation has reached epidemic proportions. For International Justice Mission, the response to exploitation is based on a simple premise. The human right to justice belongs to everyone.
On the one hand, part of our civilization is moving towards sort of just increased privilege and even entitlement for the young and for our children, and in some societies that's the concern. But the other huge portion of the world, children just live in a world that is haunted by violence. And if it hasn't come to them today, it's going to come one day. And they are utterly unprotected. There's no one to call on. There's no 911. There's no police that can be relied upon for protection. And it's open season on children.
It was an important day. It was an important day for the family that had been sexually abused and exploited by this man that we arrested today.
Buenos días, don Efraín.
Moving, extending his hand, shake his hand. Second handshake.
They will have the chance to see justice, which means restoration. And this sends the message that what happened to them was not right.
He's now outside.
After months of investigative and legal work, IJM helped provide enough evidence for the Guatemalan police to arrest Efrain Ortiz on charges of violence against women and child exploitation.
I think it was an important day for the community. There was some people and almost a mob getting together, wondering what was going on. And then they heard, they learned, and the message that was powerfully sent today is that you don't mess with your children, right? You just don't do it. And abusers, bullies, may actually get in trouble. They saw police officers doing their job today in their uniforms, right? And do it the right way.
We need to get out of this area as soon as possible. A lot of people is watching.
Mr. Ortiz is the exception. Thousands like him go unpunished in Guatemala and all over the world.
It's the same story. This woman, mother of 7 children, married to this alcoholic man, abusive, who was not only sexually abusing all of his daughters, but also he was sending them to the city dump to collect garbage. He was getting all the earnings. And if they would come back home without enough, they would get beaten. And that's exploitation. Poor families have to work all together. You see that all around the world. We work with our families. That's okay. But when you exploit them, when you beat them, when you threaten them, we're in trouble.
The poor in Guatemala have no one to call on. But access to law enforcement is precisely what human trafficking victims everywhere need.
One of the things that Polaris Project does for the United States is we operate the national hotline related to this issue of human trafficking. And so we have the task of being there, being open 24/7, and serving as this outlet for anyone to call.
Often they may have very specific information about a trafficking situation, nationalities, addresses, contacts, potential trafficker information. Other times it's extremely broad. They're new to the issue and they think they just might have seen something.
I received a text message from the Human Trafficking Hotline with a tip that a person in Falls Church, Virginia was a victim of human trafficking.
In Washington, D.C., Children are held captive by individuals who do not fit into the prevailing stereotypes of human traffickers. Anne Bakalana, an economist at the World Bank, hired Deborah, a young girl from Tanzania, to work in her home as a caregiver. But in fact, Deborah was a domestic slave.
We get calls on the hotline about these domestic servitude cases smattered all throughout the country. Oh, here's a call coming in from Wisconsin. Here's a call coming in from LA. Here's one from Houston. Here's one from New York. Here's one from the DC suburbs. And you kind of take a step back and think about it, and you think that all throughout our country, there are these mostly women held in these vulnerable situations in these homes.
I was doing everything. I was taking care of kids, 2 of them, sleeping with them 24 hours all day. There's no break, and I was cleaning too and cooking, doing everything.
The conditions that we've seen with some of our clients is that they were forced to leave, some of them not even having a room in the house that where they live in. So sometimes they would just live in literally sleeping in the kitchen of that house, just in a mat. And just so they have to just be up at 4 o'clock in the morning so they won't be on the way of anybody in the house. And then they will rarely go to sleep. They will sleep only like an hour.
She doesn't want to know or to hear or to listen to anything. And she doesn't want to stay with her kids, praying with her kids. No. It's no all the time. So they were my kids, not her kids.
Nice seeing you. It's been a few months since I've seen you, hasn't it?
Deborah's rescue was successful once Agent Bristol was able to start talking to her. He found his opportunity on Sundays when she was allowed to walk one of the children in her care to church.
I had a 60-minute window to approach her, so I followed her a few Sundays, and then I decided to have a social encounter with her in a very non-threatening way, because many people are very fearful of the police or the FBI. I had to gain her confidence first, and I decided to do that with an aid of a dog who I thought she would enjoy seeing. And it just irked me that this person who had a contract was being taken advantage of, but that's the whole part of domestic servitude. People are getting work out of them right down to the last hour. And I explained to her that you can't work and not get paid in this country. And she signed a contract to be paid. And she's complying with the contract, but she's not getting days off. And she's there with coercion, which is one of the 3 elements of human trafficking: force, fraud, and coercion.
I didn't know he was around there all the time. He wasn't asleep. He was taking care of me, really good care of me. Then I came to Polaris. It's wonderful. I never thought there's a people care.
The bottom line for us is, with every victim that we talk with, whether it's directly through our case management or through our policy work, essentially what we're doing is giving them hope that life can be better.
And so we come to Grace. Grace was a child soldier, one of nearly 500,000 fighting in armed conflicts in 19 countries around the world. At 14, Grace was abducted from St. Mary's boarding school in northern Uganda by the notorious Lord's Resistance Army, which has terrorized the region for more than 2 decades. Killing, hunger, and rape were part of her daily life. As Grace recounts, escape was not an option.
A little home that there was a man and a wife who was very pregnant, and decided to hide this girl in their hut. And the rebels knew that the girl was there, so they went and pulled her out from under the bed, and they forced us, the 30 of us, to beat this girl to death. And They killed, they beat the man that hit this girl to death. They beat the wife who was very pregnant, plus the baby in the stomach, to death. And so we left 4 people lying there.
They forced you to do this?
They forced us to kill the little girl, but the man and the woman, the rebels themselves, killed them. And then we started walking from that place.
The long march to the LRA camp in Sudan was a living nightmare.
Marching into southern Sudan was like marching into the grave. It was people, there was no water. Even the commanders that were there, that were walking with us, you could see that they're getting weak. And we could ask your friend to try to urinate for you so that you can take, but there's no urine because they have not taken any water. If you have any little food and you want to eat it, you can't eat it because it gets stuck on your throat. And children started killing themselves because you just put a gun and kill yourself because they're hungry and they're thirsty and they can't eat and they can't walk anymore. So people really started killing themselves. But fortunately, my group and I reached Sudan. Very not safe, but we reached Sudan not dead.
Once in Sudan, each child was issued an AK-47 and taught how to use it.
By the time they handle the gun, they're more than hardened soldiers. They can fight. And before they're taken, some of them are forced to kill their own parents. Some of them are forced to kill their own brothers and sisters or relatives. So by the time they leave, the child is already disillusioned. The senses of being human are already on the process to be taken away from them.
Against all odds, after nearly a year in captivity, Grace managed to escape. But many were not so fortunate, including her best friend, Miriam.
Miriam, I went with her, actually we were abducted the same day, and we were picked together, and we went to Sudan together in the same group. And I spoke to her once in a while before I escaped, because after we were taken to Sudan, even before we went to Sudan, we were not allowed to talk to each other, but we sneaked anyway to speak to each other. And so I escaped and left her there, plus the other girls in Sudan. 6 of them have been killed. Some of them beaten to death because they tried to escape. And Miriam is still in captivity up to today. I know that she's still alive. That's my hope. That's my faith that she's still alive, because she deserves life. We all do, but why did she have to remain, or why does any child have to suffer for that long? What crime have they committed that they have to suffer that long? Slowly but sure, I'm healed. You can't really, it's hard to say that you're healed, because constantly when I see all the things being done to children in different ways, it has not left me. I feel inside like pain, sharp pain inside me, that children are still going through what I went through. And I feel inside me that this kind of evil must be stopped. It should never continue, because it's worse than evil that grown-ups are actually using children in armed conflict. Grown-ups are raping children, and grown-ups are destroying the future. It's something that I've never come into I constantly want to find the answer why such a thing happens.
We give these kids scars for the rest of their life, and we create societies where children are commodities.
Human trafficking, child trafficking, exploitation, and abuse are not an inevitable condition of our human society.
But in this struggle, there is hope. Hope is poor Egyptian girls for whom one-classroom schools have been built in the center of their own communities.
If we address women's needs in terms of accessing education, being free from violence, being economic participants, our world will be better for everybody.
Hope is new and tougher laws against trafficking that are being enacted around the world. Even though not nearly enough is being done to enforce them.
I'm impatient because we should be out there fighting it. I'm impatient because convicting 3,000 people around the world every year isn't enough. Freeing 40,000 or so victims a year isn't enough.
Hope is communities in Africa that have educated themselves about human rights.
When people make these decisions to really embrace human rights together as a community and as an extended community, you see all kinds of changes happening. You see the end of child marriage. You see the end of domestic violence. You see the community standing up and saying we have to protect our children from being sent off to beg in the streets, to be trafficked elsewhere.
And hope is those who do not turn away, who do not forget.
I would never forget the look of these girls. And I'm afraid that was just a simple example in a galaxy with so many hundreds of thousands, perhaps a million of them around the world, which we never see.
We really have to help people to understand I am responsible for this. I have a dignity. I cannot destroy my own life and the life of a human being.
I can't seize a good life while there are people living like animal. Not because I'm a good person, not because it's my duty, but because he is human like me.
He is wise. He's got his mother's eyes, gladness in his heart. He's young and he is wise. My only prayer is if I can be there. Lord, oh Lord.
How y'all doing? It is my pleasure to welcome on stage our three expert commenters. We're beginning to take their seats perfectly. That's fantastic. And we'll start from your right and moving to your left. Ilgu Osler is director of the SUNY Global Engagement Program in New York City and an associate professor of political science and international relations at SUNY New Paltz. She received her PhD in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles, and is the author of many publications in her field, too many to list here. I'm partial to the article that she wrote for yesterday's Poughkeepsie Journal, which was outstanding. She's a founder and coordinator of the Mid-Hudson Valley Amnesty International chapter, as well as the faculty advisor to the campus Amnesty International group. She also serves as the board, on the board of our organization, the World Affairs Council of the Mid-Hudson Valley. Let me introduce, we'll hold our applause and then let me introduce all three, and then we can welcome them to the theater. Tiana Bien-Aimé is a lawyer and activist who is currently executive director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, the first and oldest international nonprofit organization dedicated to ending trafficking in women and girls. Prior to this position, Tiana was the executive director of the Women's City Club of New York, and was a founding board member of Equality Now, an international human rights organization that works for the protection of the rights of women and girls, and later served as its executive director between 2000 and 2011. She holds a JD from the New York School of Law and a license in political science from the University of Geneva Graduate School of International Studies in Switzerland. Oops, I am terribly sorry. I have inverted the order. 1,000 apologies to the audience. Tiana Bien-Aimé, if you would raise your hand, I'm terribly sorry. I just introduced Tiana Bien-Aimé, who's sitting to your left. And then in the center, my apologies, Nimi Gowranathan, the author of the blog www.deviarchy.com, a human rights researcher, policy analyst, UN consultant, and writer. Look for her article in a recent edition of Foreign Affairs on a very timely topic indeed. It's entitled The Women of ISIS, a reference to the group that aspires to take over northern Syria and in Iraq. The Women of ISIS, Understanding and Combating Female Extremism. She is also the lead author of the UN's National Human Rights Development Report for Afghanistan, in a position of enormous responsibility indeed. Between 2005 and 2012, she was the director of the South Asia programs for Operation USA, where she managed post-disaster and development programs in Sri Lanka, India, and Pakistan. She holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from the Johns Hopkins University. I had to mention that, that's my alma mater as well, and also a PhD in political science from UCLA. I am delighted to have these experts in human rights with us, and I hope you will extend your welcome to all three of them as we have this wonderful conversation. Thank you. Right. Okay, how are we doing with the sound? Are we doing okay here? It may not be quite as loud, but are you hearing us all right? Hearing me okay so far? Okay. This is totally unscripted. We actually just met recently. We've never tried this format before as a World Affairs Council. I'm so looking forward to this conversation, a chance for us to talk, and mostly you and very, very little of me, and for the audience to listen in on our conversation. And then, of course, later we get to open it up to questions from the audience. I barely know where to begin, except maybe just to ask the three of you and chime right in. What did you think of the film? A totally open-ended question. I didn't even tell them what questions we were going to ask. Right? What did you think of the film?
You've seen it before, so. Yeah. Do you want me to say something? Sure,
go ahead.
Well, I really am unscripted here, so I'm just going to talk off the cuff.
Go for it.
The trouble I had with the film, I liked the presentation of the film. I really enjoyed cinematically seeing the faces of the children, cinematically it was beautiful. It covered a range of issues. It wasn't just focusing, because traditionally it's always about sex slavery or sexual violence, but it covered a range of issues, so I like that. The trouble I had with it was the fact that it hasn't made the connection between the structural power connection between what we are doing here and how it affects the rest of the world, how the Western world's consumption and consumerism is affecting the structures around the world. And some of the things that I wasn't able to include, for example, in the op-ed I wrote yesterday, was the fact that I'm so troubled by the fact that, for example, the labor movement has been in such decline that they can't organize, unionize, and demand from governments better enforcement of labor laws, where they can actually check the garbage system in a city, or unionize the garbage workers so you don't have garbage pickers in places in India, or the fact that there has been a decline in educational investment around the world, right? So again, and the decline of the state capacity in general to kind of help its citizens on the most basic level to keep their dignity. So in a way, that kind of power analysis was lacking in the film. Yep. That was the only thing that, and also the connection to what we are doing here. So I'll stop at that.
Fantastic. Thoughts?
I thought one of the great things about the film was that it included the U.S. so heavily and didn't sort of focus on this as a problem out there. It did a great job of being sort of this urgent, moral, emotive appeal, right? And I've sat across from a number of women who have been in these circumstances, so I understand it. I mean, I understand the type of sort of emotions that get drawn out in this process. But I think what's really bothering us is that you see these people, women and children, that don't have any control over their own lives, right? They don't have any agency. And then the question becomes, and is the film able to explore, who is it who's giving them that agency, right? Who's giving them the control back in their lives? There are sort of three things I think that they either contribute to or have completely ignored in the film. One is sort of the gendered assumptions that existed throughout the film, right? Who's a victim and who's a perpetrator? Who's a combatant? Who's a civilian? Those types of assumptions with men and women are just as bad for men as they are for women, and it's very important when you're creating programs to understand that there are gendered assumptions there, right? The language that we're using, women and children, that becomes quite infantilizing, always connecting women and children together, right? In order to get that emotive sort of response from you, the language of victimhood, the language of vulnerability. The other aspect of it that was a little troubling was a complete lack of critique of the role of intervention in itself. A lot of these groups, some of the ones that they interviewed, they didn't mention that two of them were overtly evangelical, that their idea of justice is actually, in their mission statement, biblical justice. That gets completely left out of the film. Even the ones who are secular, you have these rights-based notions from the West coming in and being applied to local communities, right? You have an idea of justice that's tied to sort of a flawed international legal system, and not an idea of local justice, what it means to people to have individual justice. And the response to them, right? I mean, most of the response, and I've been an aid worker, so I know, to rape is essentially chickens and cows. That's what we do. If a woman is raped, we give her chickens and cows. And that becomes the response, right? We look at the psychological, the socioeconomic, the educational. We don't look at the political impact of these things, and that is essentially what's missing. You're missing the political control over their own lives. And most disturbingly, the sexual politics of aid, and this is something that you're not supposed to talk about, but when they say that many Westerners are visiting Cambodia, how many of them were aid workers themselves? How many of them were on a contract to go to Cambodia every quarter and were actually the ones doing the programs and also sleeping with these girls? So those are some of the things I think that came up as troubling.
Do we have instances of that? Or have there been investigations or prosecutions of aid workers? Or
I have personal anecdotes, which I'm not allowed to share, I suppose. But there is a number of people who recognize this. But the problem is, it's almost like the Catholic Church. It's sort of a self-reinforcing, self-silencing system. Because if you report this, if you're a woman in an NGO, it's not just a question of you losing your job. It's a question of the resources that you're in control of. Let's say to the northern part of Sri Lanka, which I cared very much about. Those people could lose the money. Am I going to take away $2 million from a village that's never gotten any help before because I want to report that a member of the board is sleeping with a prostitute in that area?
This is amazing, fantastic. Thank you very much. And Tiana, listening to hear this critique, and you've seen this film, your organization works in so many of these areas on so many levels. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, not to repeat what was said before, I think it really gives a good overview of what trafficking is in many of its forms. The one thing it didn't address was organ trafficking and child marriage, which is also, the UN has also identified child marriage as a form of trafficking. I think just to echo what was said, they don't really go to the causes of trafficking without looking at sort of the historical dimensions of colonialism, of the policies of the World Bank, of the IMF, et cetera, and its an impact on local economies. My particular area is commercial sexual exploitation of women and sex trafficking. So that's where my expertise lies, and also in terms of domestic servitude. So I'm a first-generation American. My parents are from Haiti, where there is this cultural practice called the Restaveks, which is also domestic. It's basically domestic servitude, where a young girl is promised a better education and 3 meals a day in the city, more likely than not, and then just like these children are the domestic servants, they not only work as labor traffic victims, but also very often sort of the sexual initiation of the boys in the house. So, sexual exploitation attached to it. The other part that the movie, and I realized that, I don't know the director. I know most of the people who were, by colleagues at large, to various degrees. So I know sort of where their political idea. It's a highly ideological debate, the issue of trafficking. It was alluded to a little bit, but for somebody who doesn't really know much about trafficking, it may not be obvious. The one thing that they also don't talk about is political will of governments, right? So there's not one country in the world where people aren't trafficked. Some countries have stronger laws than others. Our law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that was enacted in 2000, has a very narrow definition. So it's extremely difficult for prosecutors to prosecute. And so I think that's where there was some room for discussion, I think, as to what our role as society and as governments and as law enforcement.
I'm glad you mentioned the World Bank, right? Those of us who follow the World Bank know just how badly it fails to achieve its mission of economic development and poverty alleviation. But it appears, it would have been a great opportunity to talk about that in the film. It only appears once in the film, but it was a silent, an unindicted co-conspirator in the film, right? It was mentioned because an employee there was essentially had trafficked their worker, their domestic, without any critique or mention of the World Bank, which I thought was amazing. The World Bank appears in the film, but not really. Can I offer a false dichotomy to you? And I think false dichotomies are great teaching tools, and I'll throw this out. I know it's false. Let's say you have $1 million to spend, okay, to end the abuses of many different kinds of abuses that we saw in this film. The film seems to want us to spend that $1 million on criminal justice, on enforcement of existing laws. Would you follow the thesis of the film that this is a moral problem, an immoral response to poverty, and thus we need to enforce the law better? Or would you spend it on other things? Education, economic development that could actually produce jobs, unlike World Bank projects, family planning, and other kinds of development work. Where would you put $1 million? Criminal justice and enforcement, or economic development? The film seems to say the former. Maybe you disagree, but it seems to focus more on criminal justice than economic development.
And criminal justice is important. $1 million is not a lot.
It's not going to do a lot.
But what I would do is really invest in grassroots organizations who are working in their communities, who understand what the issues are, who are on the front lines every single day, who risk their lives to raise awareness and work on these issues. And of course, as a women's rights activist, I would give it primarily to women's rights organizations, but who also engage the community in varied ways, including engaging men and boys in the conversation.
Sure. Anyone else want to?
I mean, you know, I was recently at the Angelina Jolie's big sort of ode to sexual violence in London, and she was working with the British government, and the focus of ending sexual violence globally was that we have to work through international legal mechanisms to end sexual violence, you know? And so she's gathered these 150 world leaders, half of whom are actually war criminals in themselves and have personally or overseen mass rapes in their countries, right? But we're telling these states that this is what you're supposed to prosecute, right? This becomes a sort of self-reinforcing idea of international justice. If you look at something like Sri Lanka, which is the case that I know the best, there's all this money going into war crimes now, you know, war crimes in Geneva, and the amount of money is staggering. I mean, for an activist group, they pay $15,000 a month for a U.S. lobby to get this on the agenda in Geneva, right? $15,000 a month going into lobbying. And it builds up its own thing. It's like, okay, well, it's going to go to Geneva, and they're going to discuss it, and it's going to get stopped at the Security Council, and it can never go to the ICC because Russia and China are going to block it, but let's do this whole legal process. That's going to cost millions of dollars, right? Whereas the people in Sri Lanka who you talk to, the people in the villages, really they want to know if their relatives are dead, detained, or missing. That's it. That's justice to them at this moment. And their fear is that if these guys get brought up on war crimes, there's going to be a massive blowback on the ground to shut down journalism, shut down civil society, right? If there was $1 million, I would not put it into this current sort of international legal framework. I would put it in political mobilizing. You know, one of the women who appeared in the film is a friend of mine. She's an Indian activist who does incredible sex trafficking work. But, you know, I saw her and taught her class last week or a few weeks ago in New York, and she said, look, you know, when I go to these international NGOs, I say, you know, these poor women and they're trafficked, and let's give them some livelihood support, sewing machines, you know, they're going to make a certain amount of money. So what I actually do with the money is politically mobilize. That's what I do while they're sitting around in sewing machines. I try and get them to talk about the root causes of grievance, what is underlying the context of their lives, right? And not just political involvement, like how many women can you put in parliament, but how many women are mobilizing in informal spaces to change the context of their lives.
$1 million?
I was wondering where you were going with your statement, and I was very relieved to hear that you were talking about political mobilization on the local level, because I totally believe that advocacy is the best place we can spend the money on. You know, the governments have access to money. They can tax and they can spend the money. What needs to happen is there has to be a push in order to be able to figure out ways that we can push our governments to spend that money in the right way. And the only time that can happen is if we really do push them. And advocacy is the only way that we can make our voices heard, because really there's no other way. I was going to talk about actually some of the work that's being done by this tiny little organization called Damayan in New York City, which I find very inspiring. One of my students is doing an internship there, and it was founded by this Filipino woman who was talking to other Filipino women who had been trafficked in New York City, and they were brought in. Many of them were brought into New York City by these diplomats, and they are now actually unionizing amongst themselves to push so that they can get legal status, asylum status, or temporary protection status in the United States, using the system in a way that teaching each other, and so having agency, but also pushing the Filipino government to not treat these women whose passports are taken away as people who are illegal in the United States, right? Because they've been brought here forcefully. So it's kind of like we have to recognize that people who are trafficked also have agency, and there has to be some kind of a space created for that agency to come across and come out. And I noticed, like, when you were being a little critical of the film about who was speaking for the women, and a lot of times we didn't see just a few, right? Just the women themselves were not in the film speaking, right? So that was kind of to me a missing part of it, except for the child soldier who was speaking about her experiences. And I wish that they had talked about the Arms Trade Treaty when they were talking about the child soldiers as well. So, but.
And that, I mean, I think the way that they're using the voices of women has now become the way that we use voices. You know, at the sexual violence conference, everybody was saying, well, we're here to uplift the voices of women, and every once in a while you'd have one African woman go up and tell her story, or you would have one narrative read out about a Bosnian woman, and that was her voice and her narrative. But in the end, this is our conversation. We're just inserting their voices into our conversation. This is not their conversation, but voice becomes something that people use to justify, you know, programs and policies. And I think the money question is really central, because it's not as much governments that are providing the money anymore. It's the private foundation world that is providing the money and doing a lot of fundraising myself. I can tell you that that's a very complex process. I mean, if you think that some of the greatest social justice questions, you know, the funding for that is coming from private philanthropists, then how much of that relies on that individual person's politics, their interest, what it is they want to fund? And when you're talking about something where women need agency, they have trouble understanding that because they can't measure it, right? They can give a woman a sewing machine and say, well, she made 20 cents a day, so there's progress, we can show progress, we can measure it, it's this business model of philanthropy. But if you go to them and you say, fundamentally what you need is political agency, okay, how are you going to measure that?
Let me ask about, we talked about silences in the film, right? What's missing? How about parents? There's a missing character in the film as well. Parents, of course, also lack agency, especially if they're poor. They're wrapped up in the same complex of issues as their children. Is this a useless question to ask about why parents weren't included? The only parent that appears is this monster Ortiz, right? Who we are very satisfied to see walk away in handcuffs because of what he did to his own children. But is there a sense in which this narrative would be made richer, more interesting, and fuller if parents could be brought into the story and voices heard, or we understand their voices as we use their voices? I don't know. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, the parents it's a very complex group, right? So it's not a homogeneous group. And so there's some parents who truly believe that their children are going to the city or wherever for a better life, and there's some people who really cannot feed their children, and you know, so I think it's blaming parents within a certain sociocultural and economic situation wouldn't be helpful. And in all fairness to the film, I think if nobody knows anything about trafficking, it is a good overview and sort of I'm assuming that the director is American, and so it definitely has sort of that U.S. Angle to it. You know, what we need to focus on are the predators. You know, I think they are out there. We have laws in theory and on paper that are tools to address sort of the exploitative system, right? And we don't do that. Or the demand. You know, people focus a lot on the demand, and so you have demand for cheap labor, and you have demand for cheap products, and you have demand for commercial sex. And so how do you address demand? I think that may be a lot more helpful conversation, because I don't think there's any parent who has seen their child come into this world would willfully, if they knew what was going to happen to that child, that would be the destiny that they would want for that particular child.
Indeed. Is there too much focus on sex trafficking, both in this film and in the discourse about human trafficking as an issue? Is there too much, too little? Do we focus on it enough, or too much?
I would say, you know, to me it feels like there's been a lot on sex trafficking, but I think it goes through these sort of fads of social justice, you know, and it does bring up the question, what is the role of awareness, right? What is it, how does it actually change the lives of these people? You know, at the end there's this sort of call to action, but who are you asking us to support? Are you asking us to support some of these groups that are evangelical? Are you asking us to donate money? Are you talking about just raising awareness? I mean, I really don't think it's ever been proven that the more people know about an issue, you know, I'd like to believe that I do raise a lot of awareness, but fundamentally, does it change the lives of these people on the ground, you know? And, you know, part of that is also some of this, you know, as a human rights researcher, I'm sort of constantly conscious of the fact that this search for information in itself is quite damaging to women, right? I mean, you get this woman who's been raped, who has been trafficked or whatever, who's answered questions now from journalists, from academics, from lawyers, from, and this is this very intimate type of violence when you're talking about rape, right? And necessarily, I have to ask you about the worst thing that's happened to you in your entire life, and I need to know the details. And what I'm promising you on the other end is some elusive form of social justice, but no social programming, no ability to get back to your, house that you live in, or to see your family or whatever, right? And that becomes very, one raped and trafficked woman told me, she said, when the journalist kept calling, this is torture. This side of it, this is torture. She was raped in 3 continents, but answering these questions, this is torture. So I think if we're going to dredge up these horrible stories from women and make them, re-traumatize them, whatever, there has to be something else on the other side than awareness. I don't think awareness in itself is enough to put them through that.
I'm eager to hear the questions from the audience, but I also want to give an opportunity for other thoughts. Any follow-ups or other thoughts you want to share before we turn microphones over to the audience?
Well, I mean, just on a positive note, we've been working on the International Violence Against Women Act as Amnesty with 200 different women's organizations in DC, and there is a document that's created. It has been sponsored by several representatives, and we were able to convince our representative here, Chris Gibson, who is one of the 2 Republicans actually sponsoring it. I mean, I have partially problems with the act, but it is better than not having it, I think. So I would highly recommend that everybody sign the petitions outside that goes to Amnesty International, and we try to push our representatives to. And one of the things that the International Violence Against Women Act will try to do is to strengthen the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and also make sure that every time aid is given out by the United States government, that there is an evaluation of how that impacts violence against women. So that is one thing that is missing from how we give out money. So now, every time we send money overseas, there has to be an evaluation of what is this doing as far as enforcing or re-enhancing some of the violence against women. So that's not enforcing, but decreasing. So that's something that we can actually be happy about.
I just wanted to add for the audience, I've been doing advocacy work for about 20 years, and mostly on women and girls, almost exclusively on women and girls. And yes, I mean, I agree with Nimi. Storytelling can be very painful, it could be very dangerous, but we are the human family that really we connect with each other through storytelling. And at the end of the film, it said, "Now that you know." And yeah, telling a story in and of itself may not be that helpful in the scheme of things, but we have seen progress. I mean, anybody who works on women's rights or in other human rights violations fields, breaking the silence is really the first step towards social change. And then the question is then what structures are in place to make sure that the advocacy that we can take as individuals, whether we dedicate our lives to human rights or whether we just pick up the phone and call your political representative or send a donation, whatever capacity you can do, that it does help. And there will always be forces out there that will resist our march toward equality and justice, but that's where we should go. And that's why we need to know within obviously a healthy and helpful and positive structure, which is not always easy to have, but that's very important.
Absolutely. Stories are powerful. I was thinking about this too, the relationship in movements for social justice between narrative and critique. The two always go together. Would there have been an abolitionist movement without Uncle Tom's Cabin? As critique, it's ghastly. But as story, it's powerful and emotional. And in the context of critique, changed the world. Well, I'd love to hear some of the questions that our audience may have. We have two folks representatives, Werner Steger and Alex Putman, one in one aisle, one in the other. If you would raise your hands so that one of us or them can see you. My only caveat is to just request that your question be a question, right, as opposed to a serial monologue. Unfortunately, we don't have time for everyone to speak as much as we have. But if you would ask a question for us, we would love to try to address it. Is there a question?
This is on? Okay.
Good. Okay, right over here.
Okay, I'm interested in what we do on an everyday level. And we hear a lot about where our clothing comes from, in particular, and our goods, and what countries they come from, and what's behind their production. I'm interested in what we can do as consumers to be more mindful of what we buy, and if we can be mindful, if really it's making a difference to shop at one store over the other, or if all of our clothing is really coming from the same sorts of places.
I know in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka produces Victoria's Secret and Gap and a number of other textiles, I think it is definitely useful to avoid, the sort of divestment idea. Certain clothing lines or brands that have abusive practices, what I would say is that it has to be sort of in conjunction with a broader movement, either a social movement or an advocacy movement or a political movement, because the company's not really going to notice if you don't buy something, right? But if you can get to a point where you as a movement are able to sit down with Gap executives and have this conversation, which the people in Sri Lanka were able to do, that's quite a powerful thing. And I think members of the Sri Lankan government, they didn't care that much about the West cutting off aid because they had China. They didn't care that much about human rights conversations with India because they had China. But the two things that scared them were the divestment of economic sort of resources and trade and the war crimes question. And those were the ones that you actually saw sort of a pivot point with them. So I think it is powerful.
Can I just add one thing? The webpage of, I haven't checked this personally, but we were discussing this in the Amnesty meeting last week. The webpage of Not My Life has a link to a site. If you want to make yourself feel better about what you're wearing, they have a site where you can actually check the source of some of the companies and their production methods and stuff like that. So they have that information on the webpage. So you can go on the Not My Life webpage and check that. I haven't verified how they came up with any of that, so I'm not vouching for them. I'm just letting you know.
Listening to are you hearing through the mic okay? Listening to the Romanian prisoner, the middleman in trafficking, and his comments was really chilling. And it also led me to think about the fact he's just a middleman in Romania. He's part of a whole network of people in Romania funneling women into Western Europe. And so that means there's something much bigger going on in Western Europe. And it's not that it's not going on here or everywhere else. But I'm just curious if any of you can address from your work in the field, I mean, does Interpol and other agencies get involved and really look at the higher levels of what must be going on in these cultures to allow these people to be shipped in and out the way they are? Because obviously it's not just people at the bottom doing this, there are people at all levels involved, and I'd love to hear about that.
Well, you have, when he in particular was involved in sex trafficking. So sex trafficking is a complex multi-billion-dollar industry. The International Labor Organization came out with a report this year stating that human trafficking profits $150 billion a year, 90 billion of which is for sex trafficking. So a lot of people are making a lot of money. So you go from the mom and pop brothel owners to organized crime. Now, if you talk to people on the ground, I wanted to move the mic closer. Oh, sorry. So, if you talk to people on the ground, for instance, I don't know if your friend was Ruchira Gupta, the trafficking of girls from Nepal into India, just to give you one example, would not be possible without the corruption of Border Patrol or even here in this country. Clearly, these are crimes that we were talking beforehand are hidden in plain sight. Yes, they're underground criminal activities, but it's also hidden in plain sight. So again, I think we go back to the political will aspect that if you talk to law enforcement, they will tell you, well, we know who is responsible at the tippy top of these organized crime networks, but it takes years to gather information and evidence and et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think we're talking a lot about advocacy and movement building and movement participation, and I think it really is critical for us to keep putting pressure on our society, including law enforcement, to really look at these kinds of crimes. But I think that most of the major networks in organized crime involved in human trafficking are probably known entities by all.
And I think if you're looking at the movement of people, we don't look at the movement as perpetrators as much, right? Why is it I met a guy who was remarkably honest in Tanzania when we were there last year, who was from Amsterdam, but said that he would have never tried sleeping with a prostitute. He only tried it because he was in Africa, right? And so, you're from a place I was kept asking him, you're from a place where you could sleep with a prostitute. Is it the price? Is it, And he couldn't quite give me an answer. He said, well, it's much cheaper. It's $10, So I said, what if she was $10 in Amsterdam? And he said, no, I wouldn't do it. So why are they coming from the global north to the global south to experience this, right? What are the racial dynamics? And who at immigration doesn't know by now that there's a single older white man who's coming on vacation for a week to areas well known for prostitution, what they're doing?
Questions? Questions back.
I have a copy of the 2003 human trafficking law in my bag, and they were supposed to redo it every 2 years. I don't know if they redid it in 2006. I went to Columbia University and called the law school today. They would send me a copy. That's one question. Also, I wonder, in the 2003 law, they said there was one part of it where they could reimburse the girls that have been, or whatever, who's ever been trafficked, at least by minimum wage. And I wonder if you've ever heard that ever happening.
Are you talking about the federal law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act? It was passed in 2000, and the last reauthorization was 2008. And yes, it should be reauthorized every 2 to 3 years, but that has not happened. There is a provision in it that if a woman is arrested, for instance, after a raid or arrested on the street, if she testifies against her trafficker, then she can be eligible for what is called a T visa that would allow her to stay in the country. So it's a pretty flawed law at many levels, and it would not apply to a domestically trafficked individual, which some legislation in DC is working on, but unfortunately only for children. So I hope I answered your question. I wasn't quite sure.
This was one of the reasons why some of the arguments offered not to sign the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women has to do with a clause within that convention that says that if a woman is trafficked or forced into sexual slavery or sexual work, they should not be, and prostitution is illegal in that country, they should not be treated as criminals. They should be treated as victims of this crime. But of course, there has been some discussion that kind of took that clause within CEDAW and made it into, this document says that prostitution should be legal, right? That has been the reinterpretation by some of the conservative communities, and that's one of the reasons, among many other reasons why people have argued against signing into CEDAW. But again, U.S. had led the negotiation of CEDAW, however limited that document is, and we haven't signed or we haven't ratified it. We have signed it, but we haven't ratified it. So it's not part of the way that we think about implementing some of the laws. And if you look at it in New York State, for example, it is, a lot of underage girls who are in prostitution have been arrested for their acts in the past, and can we say that they are using free will in going into prostitution when they're children? So there's all sorts of discussions to be had about that, especially their pimps go for free. So.
You mentioned of aid workers basically going, and also they're aid workers and no one says anything because they're aid workers in fear that they'll lose money for their cause. So when does helping that cause turn to enabling it? If they're allowing these aid workers to continue, but you just turn a blind eye because they're just aid workers?
I think it's one of those things. For sure, there was a moment at which I switched and I started to talk about it quite publicly without sort of naming names and all that. I think generally within the aid industry, one of the issues is we can't have legitimate reform because nobody wants to critique within the industry. And there's this sort of unspoken rule that it'll shake donor confidence. We're not going to be able to get money if we start critiquing each other and that sort of thing. I actually think that's wrong. I think that people are more willing to give if they know that you've gone through this process of evaluation and been critical, right? And anybody, who looks at it sort of objectively, it is this perfect setup, particularly for older white men, right? I mean, you go to Cambodia, you sleep with this younger girl, right? You don't have to feel as guilty about it because you're giving money to her village, so you're supporting her in some way or the other. You come back to the United States, and then, you can tell your wife that you have to go check on the projects. You go back to this area, right? This is not something that's new or people don't know about. People know that this is happening. It's happening everywhere. There was a recent book that came out that's very good by a colleague at Columbia called Peaceland, and she looked at the social habits of peacekeepers, right? And one of my critiques of what she had was that she emphasizes this line between peacekeepers and the society, and you have to have that in order for them to be neutral and to not have kinship ties. But the only thing crossing over this line is sex. The fact that aid workers, largely single men who have the ability to travel to these areas, are sleeping with women in the villages. Maybe they're not related, but there is a tie there that is very powerful. It is likely that that village might get more protection or more money, right? So I think it's sort of known and not known, at the same time, but it is a part of the bigger issue that the aid industry does not want to critique itself.
I wanted to know if there was a relevance to the idea of the white savior complex in international view of human trafficking.
Well, I don't, there's always that element. But again, I think where we need to invest is really in local, national, grassroots organizations who are working with the victims, who are working with survivors. There's a growing, and again, I'm speaking, but I'm sure in the labor trafficking movement as well, but certainly in the sex trafficking movement, there's a growing movement of survivors who are actually, 2 decades ago, we heard very rarely from survivors, but now women who have been, 10, 15 years out of the sex trade are really informing us on solutions, and they are speaking the truth, and they are not just storytellers. They sit at the policymaking tables, they go to legislators, they travel around the world to really expose sort of all the hypocrisies and all of the harm of exploitation in the sex trade. And I think they are the ones who are going to lead the movement very, very soon. And so, there will always be white saviors. There were a number of them in the film. But unfortunately, they are the ones who have the media, they're the ones who have access, but I do think that the grassroots are coming up pretty quickly, and so we're the ones who need to support them.
I hope it's not too shocking of a question, but I had a discussion with my high school class about legal prostitution versus illegal, the countries that have it legalized or whatever, and an astounding number of them believe that the countries that have illegal prostitution are the ones that have the worst crimes, worst violence or whatever, and they feel that because it is illegal is the reason why trafficking is so bad. So I just believe that, and I just want to hear your views of what you believe. Do you believe, from what you've seen of your line of work, does it matter whether it's legalized or not?
I'll take that one. Well, yes. So right now, just briefly, there are three main legal frameworks that govern prostitution or the sex trade. There's criminalization, which is the United States, so you can't purchase or sell commercial sex, so that's the law of the land except for a few counties in Nevada. There is the legalization or decriminalization of the sex trade model, which is the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland to a certain extent, Austria, a few counties in Australia, New Zealand, and then there is what is known as the Nordic model, which focuses on demand and decriminalizes only people in prostitution, mostly women, and even the men who are in prostitution cater to men, so you're also looking at a gender inequality analysis. So around 1999, 2000, the experiments began. In Sweden in 1999, they passed a law that only criminalized the purchasers of sex, otherwise known as the demand. And it was based on a recognition that exploitation in the sex trade was a form of gender-based violence. It was violence against women, that in a world of equality, there would be no prostitution. And then around that same time, the Netherlands passed legalization. So we call it the Nordic model because a few years later, Norway and Iceland passed the same laws. And then now, France, Canada, Israel, Ireland, Northern Ireland are also looking at the Nordic model because what we are seeing, and this is actual data, it's not, even though we're very steeped in different ideologies, but what is found is that whenever you legalize or decriminalize the sex trade, what it does, it gives a green light to pimps and traffickers. So now we're seeing, just today there was an article, or 2 days ago there was an article in the Netherlands, and they're really grappling with the law because they have seen an exponential increase in sex trafficking, right? So it's a kind of supply and demand. If you live in a country where there are economic opportunities for women, then, and the demand is legal, so to speak, and the pimping is legal, then you're going to have to get the women from someplace else. And in Europe, it's from everywhere, mostly Eastern Europe, Africa. Here we have, although we don't have any legalized prostitution here, but certainly in certain counties of Nevada, a lot of Asian women. And so, yes, so there is definitely a link between legalization and sex trafficking. And there's been a report, both from the Swedish government and the Norwegian government, that has seen actually a decrease in sex trafficking in their countries with no negative consequences to increase violence against women in prostitution or and also sort of a cultural shift, right? So in Sweden, before the law passed, 70% of men thought it was okay for men to purchase women for sex, and now that percentage is less than 20%. So with it was education. But these governments also need to provide meaningful exit strategies for women who want to leave the sex industry, and without that, it's a very difficult law to enforce.
Standing answer.
What do you feel is the most effective method for combating trafficking, and how can we support it? Are there particular organizations we can support?
I think there are a number of very good local groups doing work, and what disturbed me about the film is that they sort of mix these evangelical groups with these incredible sort of very well-reputed activists who are doing really good work. There was a piece by Erin Levy Roy recently where she says that some of these international groups coming in to deal with these issues are essentially diffusing political anger, right, and sort of doling out by benevolence, which people ought to have by political right. And that's sort of, to me, sort of central to what we're talking about here. You end sexual violence, you end trafficking by political mobilizing. That's what stops it. And we have to sort of shift these oversimplistic notions of women and human rights, and to understand that the context is deeply political. We have to start funding ways for women to mobilize nonviolently. You know, a lot of what I study is female terrorism and why women join movements, because all of these things, you know, whether it's economic deprivation or the horrible experiences of sexual abduction and torture, this wide spectrum of inequity shapes their politics, right? It shapes how they think about justice and inequality and revenge. So taking up arms is not all that far outside the norm for them, you know? So to me, this approach, one, actually deals with the issue by acknowledging women's political agency, and on the other side, it minimizes things that we want to see less of, like the radicalization of women. So I think there has to be a shift in understanding that you devote resources, you devote capacity or intellectual support to informal political mobilizing.
This question might be a good opportunity for you to talk about your organization, maybe a good promotional moment. Would you like to talk about your organization just a little bit? Can we get involved?
So the CATW, Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, was formed in '88, and actually, as you mentioned in the bio, I was a founding board member of Equality Now, which is an international women's rights organization. And when we started in '92, we based our trafficking work on CATW because it looked at trafficking, in particular sex trafficking, from a gender lens. And our partners work on the ground in Mexico, the Philippines, Europe, and elsewhere with survivors and with victims. So, you know, I think because the world of trafficking is so divided, like where it's an incestuous small group of activists where you have huge ideological divides, I think what's really important is, you know, how do you mainstream these issues, you know, and it gets very complicated because, especially in my field of work, it is about gender-based violence, and we have to make the links, right? And it's not just, you know, we're talking about political mobilization, but we can't talk about sex trafficking here, or even labor trafficking of women here, and then sexual assault on campus here, and then domestic violence here. They are all linked, and they're all based on structural inequalities that really needs community-based responses. So that's that in a nutshell.
Plug for Amnesty International?
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy to join Amnesty International and come to our meetings on every third Tuesday of the month. We have meetings in Village Hall in New Paltz at 5:30, and we work on issues ranging from torture, closing Guantanamo, to actually human trafficking and International Violence Against Women Act and Violence Against Women Act in the United States, because these are not entitlements, right? They have to be approved every 3 years or 4 years, or depending on the act. And you know, it's like Congress somehow is very hopeful that violence against women is going to end in a few years. So they decide that they're going to only fund it for a few years as opposed to make it indefinite. So
2 years.
They're more hopeful than we are. So every few years we have to really push for these acts to kind of come back, so that there is a recognition that the government should be giving money so that, you know, the Poughkeepsie Women's Shelter does not get closed, or, you know, another organization that's protecting women who are being trafficked does not get closed. So again, you can come and join us in Amnesty for that. Yeah, absolutely.
That might actually be a good ending point. Let me just mention a couple more promotional notes. There's going to be another screening of Not My Life tomorrow at the Rosendale Theater in an event co-sponsored between the World Affairs Council and Amnesty International at 7:15 at the Rosendale Theater. There will be on October 24th from 9 to 1 p.m. At the Henry Wallace Visitor and Information Center, a community organization-based workshop on the topic of human trafficking and a public lecture on the same topic, November 4th at 5:30 at the Kuykendall Science Building Auditorium in City of New Paltz. This information and more will be up on the World Affairs Council website that I mentioned earlier. I'd like to invite all of us, folks who are interested, to mingle in the lobby that's just outside the theater to continue this discussion. Perhaps some folks would like to ask an unasked question of our presenters if they're able to stay just a few minutes longer, although we have trains to catch as well. And I'd like to invite all of you, if you would please, to thank our three presenters, Tiana, Ilgu, and Nimi, for their outstanding work in informing us and providing such a deep critique and context for this very powerful film that we just watched. Please join me in thanking our presenters. Thank you.
Yes,
And thank you very much for joining us.
Maybe. At the first salon with Yasmin Suga.